Hi Black Falcons! So we're going to be coming up on the end of our Bastard Sword unit that we've been working on for the past several months. And as we move on into the new year, we're going to be refocusing on the Armored Longsword of the Harleian manuscript. And this is something that we have talked about a lot in the past, but I don't know that we've necessarily really buckled down and talked about the sword type, and especially for the newer folks out there, and for everybody out in internet land who's been asking questions about this, we need to define the sword type. So I thought before we got into actual practice, I would talk a little bit about the types of swords. So when we're talking about the Harleian manuscript, we're talking about a manuscript that has two parts to it. It has a rhyme, which can be dated maybe 1380, 1390 by the language, but it was not copied down until the second half was also copied down. We can date that to probably about 1415, 1420-ish by the language. And so we have this art that specifically states it's done with the sword in two hands, and it says it's done in armor. And it's using the same terminology across the part that is the rhyme from the earlier era and the prose, which is the later era. And these two form the basis of the earliest longsword work we have in English. Now, of course, this doesn't account for things like Lichtenauer, who has his Zettel or his Merkwurst, probably a little bit earlier than Harley, maybe contemporary, we don't know. But what we do know is that if we look at Harley and say this is probably at its earliest, written around 1380, 1390, we know specifically what kinds of armor, what kinds of weapons they were using back then, and we know that if you are going to use a sword in two hands against the armor, Harley specifically tells you which techniques to use against that, and it tells you that you're using a two-handed sword. So what does that mean, two-handed sword? Well, a lot of the time when we say two-hand sword, that makes us think of something like a great big great sword, like this fellow here. So this guy comes up to about my sternum, just above the xiphoid process here, right in the middle of my sternum. And that makes it, if I reach my arm out here, comes right under my armpit. This is great for something like practicing Vadi, Filippo Vadi, who's writing in 1489, he's Italian. Fantastic, except that's easily 100 years too late. And so, even though this sword is appropriate for medieval longsword in armor, as Vadi shows us, it's not necessarily going to be correct for Harleian two-hand sword. So if it's not that, then you've got a couple other options. One of them is what is often called the bastard sword. And this is a term that is sort of a no-no, or at least it used to be in HEMA, in Western martial arts, this idea of bastard sword, because a bastard sword comes from Dungeons and Dragons. We all know that term is wrong. But if you look at the Sloan manuscript, which is where we get a lot of our information about English prize playing and whatnot, it specifically talks about people using the bastard sword to play their prize, which is their ranking. And it also talks about using the two-hand sword to play their prize. So it's a separate thing by the 1500s when they are using both of these to play their prize. So the bastard sword is what we've been looking at recently. And that's something like this fellow here. So this is the Albion Earl. You can see that it is short enough that I can still do Silver's perfect length without having to open up my elbow. I kind of turn to the side here, you can see it's easy enough for me to get my sword point like this behind my hand, and it's got a long tapered sort of point. And this is important because if I stand it on the ground, you'll see, okay, well this comes up to just above my belly button, which is about right for a medieval longsword. We'll cut in some pictures of effigies here to show you that. But it comes up to about my belly button when we stand it on end. The length is commensurate with Silver's perfect length, as he describes, and I just demonstrated. But it's got this tapered point, and this is important because this affects blade dynamics. This tells us how the sword moves, how quickly it can recover. It is specifically built for working against armor. And this is the sort of thing you start seeing developed in the 1400s. But, as I said before, Harley is coming to us from a tradition that stems, at least, from the mid to late 1300s. Well, if that's the case, what sort of sword were they using in the mid to late 1300s? Well, then we get something like this fellow. And that is a parallel edge sword that is still of this same sort of length that I can sort of reach in front of it. The blade is about the same length. The grip on this is actually a little bit shorter. You can see it comes up just a little shorter. The other one came to about here. But the edges are parallel. And this changes a lot about what we're going to be doing with the sword. Because whereas with the bastard sword, I can flip it around and I can stop it quickly, and I can make these half cuts very easily. In fact, they're more common than full cuts in the bastard sword material. With the long sword, something that is similar to probably something that like Lichtenauer would use or Fiore would use, you're going to see that it's got these parallel edges, and there are diamond cross-section weapons that become very popular during this period as well. But the balance on them, again, is similar to this than it is to our bastard sword. And so when we talk about the movements that we're making with a long sword, we're going to be talking, at least in the English medieval sense, about a sword that is probably a wide-bladed cutting sword, cuts outnumber thrusts by far in the earlier English material, and full cuts specifically, cuts that go from high to low all the way to the ground, as opposed to in the bastard sword material where a lot of them are ending here in this sort of low guard, if we're going to adopt the quarterstaff terminology as we use in our school. So that is going to be one of our considerations. So for two-hand sword, for Harleian armored longsword, we want something that has a wide cutting edge, to be a wide blade with a cutting edge. It's going to be generally parallel. You can use a diamond cross-section as well. And it's going to be tall enough that it basically reaches up just, if you stand on the floor, maybe a handspan above your belly button. And that's going to be your length that is consistent with what we see in documentation pictorially, as well as specifically the sorts of things that we see listed in silver. So there's our quick recap on the sort of sword that we're talking about with the Harleian two-handed sword. And you can post questions or comments in the link below. Have a good one.